Well, it's the science of Darwin people are most likely to encounter today as they go through school. He attempted to explain the origin of everything in purely materialistic terms. Certainly evolutionary concepts have grown a bit since the time of Darwin, so further embellishments have been added. But the basic concepts are the same. The whole idea that we could have random variation without goal, on which natural selection works to pull out certain features, that concept is still taught. And because students are going to be exposed to this, they need to know what Darwin taught. They need to know how to critically evaluate this information and how to defend themselves, at least in their own minds, if not in an open argument with teachers. They have to know how to defend Christianity to the onslaught of a purely materialistic Darwinian evolution.
Darwin had just gotten back from the voyage of the Beagle that you've learned something about. Within a year, he sat down to his notebook, which has come to be known as Notebook B, and he jotted down the first scenario that would relate to evolution. I think the thing that's really insightful about this drawing is what he wrote over the top of it. I think. And I think that's probably one of the big problems with Darwin. He was not primarily trained in science. He was trained in theology, had spent a year or so in medical school, as you know. He was not trained in comparative anatomy and himself felt that that was a great loss in terms of his understanding of the origin of species. Darwin, at his time, considered this particular model that's before you of species, which would basically argue that species haven't changed. I rather doubt anyone has actually believed that in history, that species do not change at all, because we can see that they do. And so we might call this particular model stasis, no change.
It's interesting, when we were at the museum in London, the Natural History Museum, that they actually argue in the Darwin exhibit that until Darwin, people assumed animals didn't change at all, which would presumably argue that Yorkshire Terriers were created as Yorkies and that Scotties were created as Scotties. And this is ludicrous. People were completely aware that animals varied. It's an absolute straw man. And of course, it's always easier to tackle a straw man and shoot a straw man down than it is to shoot down reality.
Such a thing has not been observed to occur. We may safely ignore it. I think in part Darwin was trying to refute such an idea, and justifiably so, except his own idea really wasn't any better, because like the first, it is unobserved. We can call this macroevolution, and when I use the word evolution for the most part in this talk, I mean the amoeba to men type of evolution, not the sort of variations that we can see day in and day out in our own bodies with aging and time and what have you. Darwin drew a tree. At the bottom of the tree was a hypothetical trunk. Over time, many of the branches are cut short. They do not extend up to the present. And at the top of the tree, you can see the branches that extend to our time. As for that trunk, Darwin never really ventured a guess. This is what he said in a letter to Hooker, Joseph Hooker, a good friend and a fellow scientist, in 1871. He says, "It's mere rubbish thinking at present of the origin of life. One might as well think of the origin of matter." And you know, things aren't that much different today. If you talk to contemporary scientists that are studying the origin of life, we call it biopoiesis. This is Dr. Paul Davies, who is a physicist and is the director of the Astrobiological Laboratory at Arizona State University. He specializes in the origin of life. And this is what he says about the origin of life. How did stupid atoms spontaneously write their own software? And where did the very peculiar form of information needed to get the first living cell up and running come from? Nobody knows. The key word I believe that he uses here is information. This is the thing that Darwin didn't understand. Darwin didn't understand that in the cell there is actually encoded information. This was all a great mystery to him. Well, this is the man himself. In fact, this is approximately the year that he published The Origin of Species, 1859. He was 51 years old at the time. And he had two basic points he made. Number one, all species of life have evolved over time from common ancestors. Now, he eventually came to see this as not something that even needed to be proven, that this was simply an observed fact. That's certainly the way it's treated today. One doesn't argue in the academic world about whether life has all evolved from a common ancestor. One only argues about the specifics of how it happened. But Darwin believed that he had an explanation for how it happened. He believed that explanation was what we call natural selection.
Christians will approach me from time to time, particularly older ones, and they'll say, I don't have to believe in evolution. I can ignore evolution because, after all, it's only a theory. Well, they're going to get a 10, 15-minute lecture when they do that. Only a theory. We use the expression why it's only theoretical. But in a scientific sense, a theory is based on a hypothesis. A hypothesis is a statement about how something works, for example, that is testable. What do we mean by that? We have to be able to do an experiment that could disprove our hypothesis. I tell people that if evolution were a theory, you ought to consider believing in it. But it's not a theory, and it certainly isn't a fact.
Darwin had four basic postulates. You can sum up all of his ideas in these. First, he said there's variation among the individuals of a species. That's a safe thing to say. His second postulate, also, I believe a very safe postulate, was that there is some mechanism of inheritance by which favorable characteristics can be passed off to offspring. His third postulate was that there is an overproduction of animals. Basically, nature is red in tooth and claw. Kill or be killed. Eat or be eaten. And he called this, understandably enough, struggle for existence. His fourth postulate is natural selection. And you could define natural selection as survival of the fittest. It's kind of interesting to think about that mechanism. Those animals that are most fit survive. Those that survive are fit. It sounds reasonable, but it doesn't say much. And so in the course of time, natural selection was redefined from mere survival of the fittest to what came to be known as neo-Darwinism, or the modern synthesis that included our growing understanding of genetics, particular population genetics. And instead of survival of the fittest, we get the expression differential reproduction. That's it. Natural selection is about differential reproduction. You either leave more offspring or you don't. And you win the game if you leave more offspring than your competitors. I'm going to build this lecture around the book Origin of Species. After all, we not only celebrate this year the 200th anniversary of Darwin's birth, but the world is celebrating the 150th anniversary of the publication of Origin of Species. 1859. And in this book, if we open it and look at it, we see that there's 13 key chapters. Actually, there's 14 chapters altogether, but the 14th chapter was a summary. And the first chapter wasn't numbered, it was called an introduction. And what I'd like to do is just go through each of these chapters and discuss some of the science and critically evaluate. Now, critical evaluation is appropriate because if we look at Darwin's introduction, he seemed to invite it. Darwin welcomed dissent. He said in his introduction of Origin of Species, "For I'm well aware that scarcely a single point is discussed in this volume on which facts cannot be adduced, often apparently leading to conclusions directly opposite to those at which I have arrived. A fair result can be obtained only by fully stating and balancing the facts and arguments on both sides of each question."
You know, it's interesting. Today, any kind of dissension from Darwin is considered almost a mark of a lack of scholarship, a lack of scientific integrity, when generally we consider any kind of skepticism to be a mark of science. Scientists pride themselves in the skeptical approach we take. You know, it occurs to me, if we were to go into a public school classroom today, or we were to go to a school board meeting and propose word for word what Darwin said in his introduction to the Origin of Species, we'd probably be thrown out for being anti-Darwinian and anti-science. I don't think Darwin himself could survive in our schools today with an attitude like that. So we've become very closed-minded.
Well, let's look at the first chapter. In many respects, this is the most important one in Origin of Species because here Darwin really spells out that which really impacted on him the most. After all, he wasn't a bench scientist per se. He had written a massive tome on barnacles, in fact, several volumes. I've never met anyone who's read it. It's tough enough reading Origin of Species. Don't touch the barnacle book. Darwin himself said he was bored to tears when he got the last barnacle out of the house. But variation under domestication, what do we mean, or what did he mean by that chapter? Domestic animals, farm animals, pets, whatever, being raised show considerable variation. I think the most important creature that impacted on Darwin was not Darwin's finches. In fact, they were really studied by another gentleman, and Darwin didn't fully appreciate their value at the time. But Darwin was a pigeon fancier. Many Englishmen are. And pigeons are really pretty interesting creatures. In fact, pigeons and doves fit together, and they belong to an order called the columbiforms, and there are a lot of them. There's about 300 species of pigeons and doves, many of which are known to interbreed. Now, it's just amazing to look at the pictures you see before you here. The pigeon in the lower corner, for all the world, looks like a turkey, doesn't it? And the one with the puffed up neck, I mean, an albatross sort of has this kind of a feature. So there's an incredible variety here, probably the wild type being something like the rock dove. Not only do these pigeons and doves look different, they have behavioral differences. There are homers. There are rollers that for some strange reason roll and tumble. So we see lots of differences among the pigeons. And of course, he saw the same thing in dogs. Dogs being raised for pets or dogs under domestication. Now, when man starts selecting for variety in animals, there's just simply no accounting for it. I mean, it's just Katie bar the door. And Darwin looked at this and he said, you know, if man can select for this kind of variety, what's the limit? If we can do it over just a few hundred years, what's the limit? This could go on forever.
The issue is not whether kinds can vary. The issue is how much variation is available. Is it without limit, or are there real limits on variation? This is where the rubber hits the road between creationists and evolutionists. Creationists would argue that yes, variation happens. We can see it. You don't argue against variation. Yes, you can select for this variation. Man can select for it if he wants a dog that looks like a Shar-Pei with his skin all wrinkled up, or if he wants a dog with short legs or long legs. But if man wants a dog with wings, that's a problem. Any breeder of any kind of plant or animal understands that there are limits to variation. Darwinism is based on the concept that there are no limits, that variation goes on and on and on. And of course, it was easy for Darwin to think this, because Darwin knew nothing about genetics. Today, there are very good genetic reasons why you cannot vary indefinitely. We can only select from what's available. You can't select for something that is not there. And in the gene pool of dogs, wings are not there.
In fact, in the process of selection, whether it occurs naturally or whether it occurs by the hand of man, there's actually a net loss in genetic information. It's believed that the wolf is sort of the wild-type dog from which all of the other canids, both wild and domestic, are derived. There's very good genetic evidence to support that. And as we go from a wolf, say, down to a poodle, there is a net loss in genetic information. Theoretically, you could start with a wolf again today, and if you spend a few hundred years working with it, you could work your way down to a poodle. But it's known it won't work the other way. You can't start with a poodle with all of the genetic information that has been lost along the way and select your way back up to a wolf. The important point here is no new information has been added. So this mechanism, this variation we're looking at, is not a mechanism for producing new genetic information. Well, let's go back to chapter 2 now of Origin of Species. This is variation under nature. Darwin was very interested in beetles. And beetles are a fascinating group of creatures. The order that includes the beetles contains somewhere between 5 and 8 million species. They comprise approximately 25% of all living things. God must have loved beetles. When we look at the ladybugs here, or I found from looking around the internet the preferred term is ladybird beetle, we see that there's an interesting variety of beetles. But they're all ladybird beetles. So we do observe limited variation. But here's the question. Is the limited variation that can be observed and about which creationists and evolutionists are not arguing, sometimes called microevolution, that's observable variation within a species, does that lead to evolution or macroevolution, the amoeba to man type evolution? This very question was addressed some years ago at the University of Chicago, a conference for evolutionists who met there, and the results were published in Science, the journal Science, back in 1980. And the results of the conference was summed up this way. The central question of the Chicago conference was whether the mechanism of microevolution could be extrapolated to explain the phenomenon of macroevolution. The answer can be given as a clear no, and capital N was in the original. I'd be content if something like this were posted on the bulletin boards of biology departments in America. I think I'd stay off the teachers' back at that point. Let's move on to the third chapter. This was called The Struggle for Existence. Darwin was influenced greatly by a gentleman by the name of Thomas Malthus. He was an English political economist. He wrote a book called Essay on the Principle of Population. In this book, he dealt largely with human populations. And being a political economist, he came up with this conclusion, that populations increase faster than the food supply, so that ultimately there is some limit on the population. He didn't see this as so much a struggle for existence. He certainly didn't see it as a way of improving mankind. It was an observation. But Darwin took these ideas of a limited food supply, limiting the population, and he concluded that there was a struggle for existence. But he went further than that. He said that this struggle for existence contributed to the whole natural selection issue, such that over time there would be infinite progress. In other words, no limit to how animals could change. So he took a basic idea of Malthus and extrapolated it to something Malthus never had in mind. When we look at food in nature and the competition for food and animals eating other animals, at least since the fall, we notice that food forms a chain. And notice as you go from the top of the food chain to the bottom, far from eliminating the populations get larger. It takes a very large population at the bottom to support the organisms higher in the food chain. Moreover, the food chain isn't just simply linear. It tends to be interdependent and highly important for the survival of the organism, not just a vicious competition of tooth and claw. So that the struggle for existence doesn't necessarily turn out as Darwin saw it, but is a beneficial mechanism for the general welfare and survival of the organism. The fourth chapter dealt with natural selection. That's the heart and soul of Darwinism. Darwin was not the first to come up with natural selection. In fact, almost everything that Darwin said, you could show somebody long before him had said something very much like it. Indeed, the ancient Greeks had covered most of this ground. I'm not interested in priority. Whatever we can say of Darwin, we can say one thing. He really impacted on the world. His ideas became accepted by the average layman, more so than the scientist of his day.
Sometimes I think evolutionists are actually surprised to learn that creationists believe in natural selection. We believe in artificial selection as well. First of all, what is selection? It merely is this, that in the genes of the species there's some variability. We call this variability, or what's responsible for this variability, are alleles. Different versions of a gene. That's how you account for having brown eyes and blue eyes and different color hair and lots of differences. About 6 or 7% of all of our genes have alternative versions called alleles. So we can select for these, but the big difference between the evolutionist and the creationist is how far can you go with this selection.
He was influenced, nonetheless, by a man named Edward Blythe. Blythe was an English zoologist and pharmacist. Interesting guy, Bible-believing Christian. And sometime before Darwin, in fact, 24 years before Darwin's publication of The Origin of Species, Blythe published 3 articles on natural selection, which he called natural selection, in the Magazine of Natural History. That was from 1835 to 1837. Now, this was an extraordinarily popular journal. Most of the scientists of Darwin's day who worked in this field published in this journal. Darwin subscribed to it, and in Darwin's own library to this day are the volumes of this magazine with Blythe's comments underlined. So we know he was influenced by Edward Blythe, something he rarely acknowledged in his writings. What did Blythe say about natural selection? Blythe said natural selection is a mechanism that maintains stability of the species by eliminating the abnormal. Blythe, being a Christian and a creationist, believed that yes, there's variability among the individuals of a species, but they don't go on to form something fundamentally different. And that yes, since the fall into sin, there will be defective organisms, mutant organisms, if you will. And natural selection was a way of removing the mutants, and in this way preserve stability. Darwin took this idea, basically turned it on its head. You're all familiar, I'm sure, with this example of natural selection. It's in a moth that is of the genus and species Biston betullaria. These moths are like people in the sense that they come in a variety of shades from white to dark. And here they're shown on a tree trunk. It's said that by the fellow who first really made this study, called industrial melanism, Kittlewell, that the moths resided in the trunks of certain trees that had white lichens growing on the trees. And as you can see, the black moth is quite easy to pick out, but the white moth that's encircled with yellow is very difficult to see. Even when I know where to look, I have trouble seeing this moth. Kittlewell assumed that birds would have equal difficulty seeing this moth, and so that they would normally eat the black moths, leaving the white, and the white would be the most populous of the moths. And initially that appears to have been the case. There were more white moths than black moths. With the Industrial Revolution, soot was produced in the air. This soot not only darkened trees, but it killed the lichens, producing a bark such as you see on the left. And here notice that the white moth stands out. And now the black moth is the one that is difficult to see, and Kittlewell assumed that the birds would then eat the white, and the blacks would become relatively more numerous among these moths. There are several reasons why this interpretation can be called into question. Similar observations were made in areas where there wasn't any industrial pollution. A few years ago, a couple of books were written, one of which was written by Judith Hooper, called Of Moths and Men, Intrigue, Tragedy, and the Peppered Moth, in which she implies that Kittlewell was not a man very careful with his science. Others have continued to defend the idea that the peppered moth is an example of natural selection. I've always felt this way about the peppered moth. What did we start with? A peppered moth. And what did we end with? A peppered moth. And for a long time, the peppered moths were just simply referred to as Biston betularia. Several years ago, when I was giving, 30 years ago, I said, I'll bet someday will come when they'll change the name. They'll call the black moth something else, and that'll create a new species, just by naming it a new species. And I pulled a name out of the air. I said they might call it Biston carbonaria. That has happened. I'm a psychic. Everyone here who believes in psychokinesis, raise my hand. Okay. Well, one fellow took exception to this criticism. After all, this is the most powerful argument for evolution in our textbooks, primarily because it's so easy to understand. Little children can follow it. And so Dr. Michael Majerus has studied all of this further, and he says that Hooper really didn't get it right. In any event, he says the peppered moth is perhaps the most visually impacting and easily understood example of Darwinian evolution in action. It should be taught. It is, after all, the proof of evolution. So here it is. This is as good as it gets, right here. Well, let's look to the 5th chapter, Laws of Variation. Here, Darwin's in hot water, or deep water, I should say. He has no knowledge of the mechanism for variation. He is not aware of what we have come to know as Mendelian genetics. Darwin was primarily influenced by this man, Jean-Baptiste de Lamarck. He was a French naturalist, and one of the ideas he came up with is that nature is a case of use it or lose it. If you use your muscles and you lift weights, you can build large muscles. And if you lie in bed and are completely inactive, you get muscular atrophy. So use and disuse, well, that's certainly true. There is a relationship there. But he believed that what you acquired in this way could be passed on to your offspring. This was called inheritance of acquired characteristics. By this notion, presumably somebody who lifted weights would have children born to them that were very muscular at birth. Well, this idea, of course, has fallen into disrepute, although we're coming back to it a bit. We're finding out there are things that occur outside of the genes. They're called epigenetic phenomena. And so maybe Lamarck will get his due yet. Darwin vacillated at one time, sort of accepting Lamarckian ideas, at another time not, but he really had nothing to take its place. You see, this is the key man. This is the man who we should be celebrating on his birthday. This man did more for biology than Charles Darwin ever dreamed. This is Gregor Mendel. He was a contemporary. Charles Darwin was an Austrian priest, and he is the father of genetics.
This whole business we call today Mendelian genetics, without that, biology isn't even possible, I don't think. Biology works perfectly okay without Darwin. It worked perfectly okay for many years before Darwin. Some of the most startling discoveries in biology occurred before Darwin, and many discoveries after Darwin take no notice of Darwin's work. But it's really difficult to imagine contemporary biology without Gregor Mendel. He really spelled out how it's possible for a plant or animal to control or to leave a legacy to its offspring that explain how to make another copy of the parent and, more importantly, how to vary a little bit from the parent. I think one of the reasons that Mendelian genetics didn't catch on quicker than it did is because it seemed to present a challenge for Darwinism. It seemed to be a little too lockstep. Inheritance was based on specific genes that could be inherited, and these genes seemed, at least at first, to be fixed. And later we found out that there can be some variation because there can be different versions of genes. But I can't imagine biology without Mendel, and I spent my entire career without Charles Darwin.
He studied inheritance of traits in pea plants, and he was a very thorough investigator. He studied 29,000 pea plants, so he did thorough experiments and made observations. And he came up with the two basic laws that we now call Mendelian inheritance in 1866. This was a few years after the publication of Darwin's Origin of Species. Some historians maintain that he did make a copy of his paper available to Darwin, who presumably didn't pay any attention to it. We can excuse, I think, people for not being aware of Gregor Mendel's work because he published in a very obscure journal. And his work was essentially lost for 35 years. It was rediscovered by Hugo de Vries. Not only that, but most people believed in Darwin's ideas of inheritance, which involved something rather nonspecific called pangenesis in gemmules. One wonders if Darwin would have changed his views if he would have understood the nature of inheritance. But he didn't, whatever the reason.
Ultimately, for evolution to work, we have to have a way to break the barrier on the variation and to be able to select for things that aren't even in the gene pool of the species. How do we select for something that isn't there? Well, obviously, we have to bring it into the gene pool. So what is the source of the new genetic information? According to evolution, the source would have to be mutation. Ultimately, mutations are really the only source of fundamentally new genetic information. Now, do creationists believe in mutations? Yeah, we do. We definitely do. Another word for something that causes mutations, we use the word mutagenic for something causing mutations. Another word is carcinogenic. So cancer forming, mutation forming, basically synonyms. Isn't that interesting? This is why people really don't want mutation.
Now, fortunately, most mutations are not quite that draconian. Dr. James Crow is professor and chairman of genetics at the University of Wisconsin, makes a valid point here. And that is, the typical mutation is very mild. It usually has no effect, but shows up as a small decrease in viability or fertility. That's your most typical mutation. This has led Dr. Motu Kamira, one of the great evolutionary geneticists in the world today, to study what indeed does natural selection select for in mutations. Just how much of a mutation do you need to be selected for and contribute to the population? This is Chimera's distribution, and it's an interesting one. That line up the middle with a 0 at the top represents a perfectly neutral mutation. It's neither good or bad. To the right of that vertical line would be all the good mutations. Notice he doesn't put any in there. And he says in his papers, why not? He's not aware of any demonstrably good mutations for an organism in its normal environment. Rather, all the mutations he indicates are to the left of the neutral line, the deleterious ones. What really is interesting is he doesn't even show the curve coming up to the 0 because he doesn't know of any truly neutral mutations or that are absolutely neutral. So they range from very, very mildly harmful to way off to the left there, that would be a lethal. Now, there's no question, lethals will be selected for by natural selection, and these will be removed very quickly in short order. The problem is the curve where most of the mutations are occurring. And Chimera showed what he called the no selection zone. The no selection zone is a zone where, because there are so many steps between changes in the DNA and the phenotype, that is how the organism expresses the effect of that DNA, there's so many layers and so many steps that natural selection simply is not able to identify and remove mildly deleterious mutations. As a result, organisms accumulate a genetic baggage. This is why brothers and sisters, even first cousins, ought not to marry today, because they each carry mutations, and you could get two alleles that might not be harmful by themselves, but in a double dose could be lethal. And so all organisms are accumulating a genetic baggage. Natural selection not only does not select anything new, which if it existed would be some tiny little effect that would fall well within the no selection zone, it can't even remove all of the mildly bad mutations, and so genetic baggage increases with time. Well, evolutionists are aware of the problem. This particular gentleman publishing in the Annual Reviews of Genomics says, and I quote, "It remains a mystery how the undirected process of mutation combined with natural selection has resulted in the creation of thousands of new proteins with extraordinary diverse and well-optimized functions." That's extraordinary indeed. When you realize that a protein is made up of little subunits called amino acids, there's 20 different kinds of amino acids, and a typical protein's over 500 amino acids long. So ask yourself, how many strings of beads could you string? 500 beads long, using 20 different color beads of endless supply. That would be a lot of strings of beads that would be different at least by a few beads. Well, let's look at what Darwin called difficulties on his theory. He did recognize some difficulties. I'm just going to touch on a couple, two. One is he recognized that nature had the appearance of design. This is something people are kicking around today. Here's a truss that's very popular. In fact, the building we're in right now has these trusses. I know, I saw it under construction. It's believed to be by engineers the strongest truss that can be made for its weight out of steel. And it's known as a Warren's truss. Here's the test should you wish to take it. Who designed Warren's truss? I just love it when students say Warren. I just enjoy failing students. I'm sorry. You see, Warren was scooped by about 6,000 years, because if you look at a vulture, not one of the prettiest birds, and you look at the bones of the palm, the metacarpal bones that make up part of the wing of the vulture, and you saw down the center of that bone, open it up and look in, take a look at what we see. Warren's truss. Yes, design is there. Darwin recognized it, but as the scriptures tell us in Romans chapter 1, man suppresses the truth in unrighteousness. A second problem Darwin had is with his tree. People have attempted to come up with a tree. This has been one of the goals of science. This evolutionist is quoted in New Scientist in January of 2009, a fairly recent quote. He said, and I quote, "For a long time, the Holy Grail was to build a tree of life, just as Darwin had proposed early when he was a young man. A few years ago, it looked as though the Grail was within reach, but today the project lies in tatters, torn to pieces by an onslaught of negative evidence. Many biologists now argue that the tree concept is obsolete and needs to be discarded. We have no evidence at all that the tree of life is a reality." Let's look at that tree. You want to get a little closer to the truth? Take that tree and tip it upside down. And when you tip it upside down, truncate it. Because you see, we notice when we look at the fossil record, we look at animals on Earth today, there are fewer species today than there was in the past. It should be the other way around with the tree. What is the evidence for that? Well, let's look at it. It's called extinction. By the way, here's an area where creationists and evolutionists get along famously. They both agree that there is extinction. Evolutionists believe in a higher rate, at least in history, than creationists do. Evolutionists say, for example, that 99.9% of all species that have ever lived are now extinct. Looking at today's rate of extinction, which is observable, it is argued that a distinct species of plant or animal becomes extinct every 20 minutes. Now here's your question. Where are the new animals springing into existence comparable to the ones we're losing? In fact, some estimate that half of the presently existing species will be extinct by 2100. Darwin saw this as a real problem. Lots of extinction, but where are the intermediate forms and the new species that show the production of things new? And so he had another chapter in his book called The Imperfection of the Geological Record. He attributed the whole problem to just simply lack of data, that if we had all the data, everything would turn out his way. But where are the missing links? Darwin said in this chapter, and I quote, "But just in proportion as this process of extermination has acted on an enormous scale, so must the number of intermediate varieties which have formerly existed on Earth be truly enormous." He went on to say that why then is not every geological formation and every stratum full of such intermediate links? Geology assuredly does not reveal any such finely graduated organic chain. And this perhaps is the most obvious and gravest objection that can be urged against my theory. The organisms that would be new, because we know a lot of them are becoming extinct, but where are the new ones? Well, we're getting to the end here. We're back to the 10th chapter. This one dealt with geological succession of organic beings, how the geological column would show a sequence. And it's true, we do see some patterns in the geological column. Those patterns are suggested here, but the thing that's intriguing, the dotted line occurs between the Cambrian and the Precambrian. According to evolutionists, that would be 500 million years ago. And at that point, all of the basic phyla are already in places. It's called evolution shot out of a gun. The evolutionists call it the Cambrian explosion. And do we find this nice ladder of life that you see in the textbooks? Hey, if you want to climb up the ladder of life, there could be no better place to go than Grand Canyon. It's the largest exposure of the geological column in North America. Go down to the bottom and climb your way up, you just go right up the ladder of life, huh? No. How do I know? I tried it. Here it is, Grand Canyon, beautiful place. Those layers are supposed to have been deposited over very long periods of time, layer by layer. Never mind how long it took to form the canyon, the layers themselves are supposed to have formed over a very long period of time. In fact, dating back before the Cambrian, before multicellular forms of life, up to at least the beginning of the age of the reptiles. If you look at the characteristic organisms that have been reported in each layer, we find, starting at the bottom, one-celled cyanobacteria. Well, that sounds reasonable, although the animals, those creatures are still around today. The next layer you find marine invertebrates, trilobites, oysters, clams, worms, and brachiopods. In the next layer you find marine invertebrates, bryozoa, crinoids, and foraminifera. When you get near the top of the Grand Canyon, there's a layer there called the coconino, in which footprints have been found of amphibians and reptiles. And finally, when you get to the top, no more footprints up there. Up there you find fish teeth and sponges. Sponges are only found there. They're believed to be the most primitive of multicellular creatures, according to evolutionists. There is, in fact, no vector of progress here. Well, back to Darwin, last chapter. Last chapter, the very last one is just a summary. That's the 14th. The 13th chapter deals with mutual affinities of organic beings. One of the things he dealt with here is homology. Well, I'll tell you, as an anatomist, and that's what I did for a living for many years, I taught in a medical school, I can tell you homology is real. We could look at these skulls here, and no matter what kind of a skull we look at, a nutrient foramina or a hole here in one skull will be found in another. I can look at a rat, a cow, I can look at any mammal and find similar apertures for the cranial nerves. There is definitely a theme there. Definitely a theme. And what does that mean? Of course, Darwin argued that that proves common ancestry. That's what evolutionists argue today. For example, looking at limb homology, you see the same basic bones starting from the left, the salamander, then the crocodile, then man, bird, bat, and horse. They all have a humerus. They all have a radius and ulna. They all have carpal bones, metacarpal bones, phalanges. They're just patterned along a little different theme. You know, it's interesting that when man has tried to design a robotic arm to work in an area where you can't be because of radiation or something, he designs it the same way. You can't improve on it. And so in other words, homology can tell us something about the mind of a common creator. Not necessarily. an evolutionary process. It can tell us that a certain pattern is optimum. Nobody's improved on it. But there's something else about homology. Homology, if it's to be meaningful in evolutionary terms, must mean that everything has evolved from a common genetic anlage or foundation. But we know that's not true because clearly homologous organs in different animals can actually come from different germ layers of the embryo. Here's an interesting example here. Pentadactylism, 5 fingers, is widespread in vertebrates, even in horses. Embryologically, the fingers are there. But if you look at the human hand with its 5 digits, it develops in a completely different way than, say, a frog with its 5 digits. In man, we start with a paddle, and there's programmed cell death that dices off the fingers. This is called apoptosis, if you like fancy words to pass around at the next party. In the case of the frog, that's not how it develops. The fingers literally bud and grow out. There is no programmed cell death or apoptosis. So the whole mechanism of development can be quite different. Evolutionists have looked to proteins and DNA to see if maybe there might be a homology there. And in fact, it's the study of DNA that's led to the abandonment of the phylogenetic tree. It just doesn't match with what we think we knew. For example, if you take a very, very common protein that's widespread in nature, like cytochrome C, and you compare how different is the protein cytochrome C from that in a bacterium on the left. How different is it from the cytochrome C of a horse, a pigeon, a tuna, a silk moth, wheat, and yeast? That's quite a diversity there, isn't it? It turns out that the percentage difference is in the range of 60% to 65% equally across the board. No phylogenetic story there either. Also, Darwin addressed vestigial organs, that there appear to be organs no longer useful. And you've heard of the famous ones, the so-called tailbone, huh?
What about the vestigial organs? So almost all of them have been shown now to not be vestiges. The tailbone is simply where our vertebral column ends. If you think about it, it has to end someplace, right? It is a linear structure, and one end has a head on it. And the other end has to end someplace if it's not going to be in a ring. And wherever it ends, there an evolutionist will be standing, pointing, saying, ah, a tail. In fact, that bone is not useless. It's not a useless leftover. That little bone we call the tailbone or coccyx is an anchoring point for many muscles of the body that form our pelvic diaphragm. I would not consider the body to really contain any vestigial organs of evolution because I don't believe evolution has occurred. But Darwin, for example, could see vestiges where maybe you and I would never notice them. One of my favorite examples of Darwin's vestige is now known as Darwin's tubercle. You can take your finger and touch the inner margin of your ear right about here. And most people will feel a little bump there, a little tubercle, if you will. And you'll never guess what that represents. That represents a vestige of when we once had floppy ears. Think of a dog or something with floppy ears. And so that little floppy ear has now been reduced to this tubercle. That's the kind of absolutely unscientific, incautious thinking that just flourishes in the whole evolutionary worldview.
Well, we come to the end, and the last thing I wanted to share with you is whether Darwinism is true or not. Is it really important? Can you practice medicine without Darwinism? Can you be a bench scientist without Darwinism? For 34 years, I served in the faculty of one of America's very top-tier medical schools. I did not teach evolution.
I found in my own career in teaching medical students, I never bothered to teach evolution. If I gave a lecture on, say, the kidney, I could have saved 5 minutes at the end of the lecture to speculate on how we come to have kidneys before we had kidneys. It would have added nothing to my students' understanding of renal physiology or anatomy. It would have contributed nothing to their ability to practice medicine. And so I didn't do it. And in 34 years, I never had a single complaint from a student. I never had a single student say, Dr. Menton gives a very fine lecture on the various organs of the body, but we notice he's leaving out evolution, and we really miss it. Never.
And yet, the famous evolutionary geneticist, now deceased, Theodosius Dobzhansky, said back in 1973 something that's been repeated many, many times since, and that is, nothing in biology makes sense except in the light of evolution. You can't make sense of biology. Well, that's not true. In fact, this evolutionist, Adam Wilkins, publishing in Bioessays, a special issue on evolutionary processes, said, and I quote, "While the great majority of biologists would probably agree with Theodosius Dobzhansky's dictum that nothing in biology makes sense except in the light of evolution, most can conduct their work quite happily without particular reference to evolutionary ideas." Here's another quote you may find interesting. This is by Dr. Mark Kirshner. He specializes in evolution. He is the chairman of systems biology at Harvard Medical School and is the author of a book on evolution. And writing in the Boston Globe, the 23rd of October, 2005, this is what he said. "In fact, over the last 100 years, almost all of biology has proceeded independent of evolution, except evolutionary biology itself." So if you're going to teach evolutionary biology, you need it. He talks about his fields. Molecular biology, biochemistry, and physiology have not taken evolution into account at all. Some years ago, the distinguished Canadian biologist W.R. Thompson was asked to write an introduction to a particular publisher's Origin of Species, the J.M. Dent and Sons Company. Thompson says, "You really don't want me to write this introduction." He said, "It's not going to be a hymn to Darwin." They said, "Sounds interesting. Go ahead and write it." He wrote a 16-page introduction. One of the things he said, and I think it sums up this lecture so perfectly, "A long enduring and regrettable effect of the success of the Origin of Species was the addiction of biologists to unverifiable speculation." He went on to say the success of Darwinism was accompanied by a decline in scientific integrity. This is already evident in the reckless statements of Haeckel and in the shifty, devious, and histrionic arguments of T.H. Huxley. This is a gentleman that got an entire page of Science as an obituary when he died, one of Canada's premier biologists. You know what I'm going to do? I'm going to let Darwin have the last word. Does that sound fair? We'll just let him say his piece and we'll let it be. Charlie, tell it to us. This in a letter to Asa Gray, 1860. "I feel most deeply that this whole question of creation is too profound for human intellect. A dog might as well speculate on the mind of Newton. Let each man hope and believe what he can." I thank you.